Hey everybody, this is Murray back with you with edition number 33 of Lone Star Diary. We hadn't made one of these in a couple of weeks, and I decided, well, it was time that we do it. And I'll tell you folks, over here in Texas, South Central Texas, where I'm located, the heat has been unbearable. It was about, around 6 p.m. It was still 104 in the shade on my back porch. So it's been pretty miserable. And I hope where you're at, I hope you're not having to deal with it, because it's not any fun. And besides that, we're in the middle of a drought in this area, so that just adds to it. Well, friends, I was thinking about the heat, and I was thinking about how bad it must have been back in the early Texas, riding in a stagecoach in all this heat. And they had to do it. And they had to fight dust and all kind of elements to get where they needed to go. Of course, back then they never had been accustomed to air conditioning, so maybe it didn't hurt them quite as bad. But this story I want to tell you, it's called Riding the Stage in Old Texas. And I'm going to begin with it right now. Try, if you will, to imagine yourself traveling from Gonzales to Galveston in the middle of July on a stagecoach that would take at least 3 days to reach its destination. The choking dust filling your nostrils, the intense heat, and the ever-present fear that you might become the victim of a holdup would make for a very memorable trip, to say the least. In 1853, the same year that the Gonzales Enquirer newspaper was established, stagecoach lines were the main mode of travel to other parts of the country. And according to old issues, these coaches were operated on certain days, and they also carried the mail. People in Gonzales were lucky if they received their mail every other day. And also, according to old issues of the Gonzales Enquirer, stagecoaches operated on regularly between Gonzales and various ports of entry on the Gulf Coast. These included Port Lavaca, Indianola, and Galveston. The coaches would take passengers back and forth from these ports to other locations in the interior of the state. In the late 1850s, old issues of the Enquirer contained advertisements from the Goss and Perry stage line. This firm proudly claimed that their stages could deliver passengers from Austin to Indianola in 48 hours. And I'll tell you, friends, that was quite an accomplishment back then. The Enquirer also reported that stagecoaches left Gonzales every Monday and Thursday mornings, returning every Thursday and Friday evening. Towns on the route included LaGrange, Columbus, Chapel Hill, Brenham, Washington, that's Washington, Texas, and all connected with the New Orleans and Galveston steamers. Stage stands, also known as inns, were located at various points along the routes. Here, the passengers were fed, and fresh teams of horses were provided to pull the coaches. Inns in the towns were usually located in a boarding house or a hotel. They provided modest accommodations, but after hours in the rough riding coach, they must have offered a welcome respite. Some of the stage inns were rowdy places. Fights were known to happen. Their level of violence probably depended on how many bottles of Who Hit John were consumed. When the stage lines hauled the people, the freight lines carried the merchandise. Information obtained from the old newspapers provides us with somewhat vague accounts of how supplies were transported in the 1850s. This information does indicate, however, that all freight coming and going out of Gonzales was transported by wagon train. The freight routes leading from Gonzales to the principal ports on the coast were well marked. Most of the supplies bound for Gonzales in the interior of Texas came up from Indianola and Port Lavaca. The old freighters traveled in companies or trains to maximize their hauling capabilities and for safety's sake. It must have taken a tough old boy to be a freighter or stagecoach driver in those days, what with the Indians looking to lift your scalp and bandits more than willing to shoot you and steal your cargo. Newspaper reports also indicated that the coaches carrying the mail were the most likely targets for robbers. Many encounters were made with these desperados, and the good guys didn't always win. When the railroad finally came to Gonzales, the stagecoaches and the freight-carrying wagon trains passed into history. They had served their purpose well, keeping these communities on the frontier supplied with flour, sugar, coffee, building materials, guns, and the like, as well as the fancy hats and dresses for the ladies. I'll bet folks didn't take anything for granted back then. They probably just really appreciated receiving a letter or finally seeing that new shipment of coffee arrive. I can only imagine how excited they must have been to greet a loved one arriving on the evening stage. Finally here, safe and sound, after days of hard riding and somehow avoiding the dangers of the trail. You know, some people might say that this all sounds like some sort of fictional nonsense from a low-budget Hollywood Western. Well, maybe so. But in Gonzales and many others like it in the 1850s, it wasn't a scene from any movie. No, my friends, it was a fact of life. So there you have the story of riding the stage in old Texas. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what these people must have suffered through to get to where they wanted to be and to get to see their loved ones and what have you. It couldn't have been a comfortable mode of travel. And when the railroads came along, it probably was like crawling out of a Model T and getting into a Cadillac, because those stagecoaches were a rough way to travel, to say the least. But anyway, friends, I hope you got something out of this. Maybe you learned a little bit of history. All these stories come right directly out of the old newspapers. So I believe them. I believe they're true, because you had reporters on the scene back in the day that were actually telling these stories and telling them true. So that's all for this time, friends. I appreciate you listening to this edition of Lone Star Diary, and I'll hope that you'll join us next time for another story from Lone Star Diary. In the meantime, God bless Texas. Good night, everybody.